I am today formally endorsing Governor Kasich for President of the United States. So without further ado, I give you Governor John Kasich, the next President of the United States.
All right, we can all step right up and get right in line here. Anybody want to? No, just kidding. So, Mary Ann, you are really smart and good, isn't she? Smart and articulate and very good judgment. And then we've got Brent back here, the former speaker. You know, he's a big wrestling coach too. You know that. They told me you like wrestling in Iowa. Is that true? Yeah, I've heard a little bit about that. And of course, where's Carl? Where's Carl Hunt? Is he here? Where is he? He's just had a big, there he is way in the back. He's drinking back there. No, he's not. But, he had me up at the Council Bluffs. So let me tell you a little bit about myself, and then we're going to go to questions, okay? And we'll do this as long as we can, because I was in New Hampshire for 2.5 days after I announced my candidacy. I went to South Carolina. Now I'm here, and then I'm headed to Michigan. And, you know, Ohio and Michigan. I told them when I was there the last time, look, I know we have our differences, but let's just put them aside as we get through this election. So I grew up in a little town outside of Pittsburgh called McKees Rocks. Now, we have something in common with Iowa, and that is we got a lot of ethnics in Iowa. I grew up in a blue-collar Democrat community. Really did not spend much time around Republicans because we just didn't have them. And my father carried mail on his back, and his father was a coal miner. And my mother, her mother lived with us off and on, and she could barely speak English. My father was, you know, part of the glue in the community. My mother was a highly opinionated woman, but not educated. And so it was a place where if the wind blew the wrong way, people found themselves out of work. And one of your reporters back here grew up in a town not far from me. And somebody asked me today, you have these things that say Kasich, for us. What does for us mean? Who's us? Well, you talk to this young woman back here who grew up in the town next to me. These are people who played by the rules. These are people God-fearing, basically Ronald Reagan Democrat conservatives. And we didn't get the special tickets to events, and we didn't get the certain breaks that people got. And those folks are still in my mind's eye, because they're people sometimes that can get run over in life, and I don't like that. I'm sort of a believer in the underdog. That's what I've always been. Well, anyway, I left McKees Rocks, went to this small little school in the Midwest called Ohio State. And
The Ohio.
There you go, the Ohio State University. And it's a very big school, just like your university, but ours is, I think at that time, was, you know, we had 48,000, and I found myself in the dormitory that was 23 floors high. And I was on the 21st floor, and I had 15 college roommates. And things got, you know, I mean, it was kind of difficult there, and there were some things that happened, and I didn't like it. And my Uncle Emil always said, Johnny, always start at the top. So I demanded a meeting with the president of the university so I could tell him what I'm concerned about. They wouldn't let me in, and I just kept at it, and finally they did. And I went in to see the president, and he was a very impressive guy, wonderful man, big and tall, baritone voice, and they've named buildings after him over the years. So I walked in to see him, and it was impressive. He had beautiful desk and carpeting, and he had this assistant who had been keeping me out of the office, and he looked at me and says, what's on your mind? And so I told him about my concerns, and I said, sir, I've been in school about a month, and I'm undecided here at Ohio State, but when I look at your assistant, the carpeting, the furniture, maybe this is the job for me, you know. What exactly do you do? So he told me about his fundraising responsibility, his academic responsibilities, and he says, tomorrow I'm going to go to Washington and have a meeting with President Nixon. And I said, sir, there's a number of things that I would like to talk to him about also. Do you think I could go with you? And he said, no. I said, well, if I go home and write a letter to the president, would you give it to him? Now, how many opportunities do you have to hand a letter directly to the President of the United States? So he said, yeah, that'd be fine. So I went back to my dorm and wrote a letter, basically inviting myself to the White House, and I signed it sincerely, John Kasich, P.S. If you'd like to talk about this further, let me know. I've got time. I'm a college student. So a couple weeks later, I go down to my mailbox, and there's a letter from the office of the President, the White House, and I open it up, and I go upstairs, and I call home. Because you know where this is going, don't you? I call home, and my mother answers the phone. My mother, who's, blue-collar housewife. I said, Mom, I'm going to need an airline ticket. The President of the United States would like to have a meeting with me in the Oval Office. And my mother starts shouting, honey, pick up the phone. Something's wrong with Johnny. So it created a big discussion, right? But our kid's gone for a month, and this is ridiculous. So they ended up getting me a ticket. I flew down to Washington. I went through the gate, and I found myself right outside the Oval Office. And there's actually some furniture there that is still there from that time long ago. And a guy walks up to me, and he says, okay, young man, you're going to get 5 minutes alone with the President of the United States. What do you think? Pretty impressive. What do you think? It's pretty amazing. Let me tell you what I think. I got a new jacket, a new shirt, a new tie, and new pants. I didn't come here for 5 lousy minutes. I'm not leaving. And they opened the door, and there's the president. I shake his hand. They introduce the president to me, and we sit down at his desk. And the good news is I spent 20 minutes alone with the President of the United States at the age of 18. The bad news is I spent 18 years in Congress, and if you add up all the time I spent in the Oval Office, I peaked out at the age of 18 and should have moved to Iowa. Huh? So it's sort of like the history of my life. I have been struck by lightning so many times. Or another way to look at it is, for whatever reason, the Lord's put me on a path where I could have some ability to affect things. And affect them on the basis of what I talked to you about earlier, about helping people to get up, about growing the economy. I mean, the one thing that I did learn is that our most important moral purpose is, as a public official, is to make sure we have job creation. So I ran for the legislature. I was 24 and a half years old, and I knew no one. I had people like you, and many people just like you. Most of them had never been in politics before. And when I was running for this job, people said, he can't win. In fact, the weekend before the election, Marianne, they said he's a fine young man, but he's got no chance. And election night, I swamped the guy by a grassroots, door-to-door campaign. And I went into the legislature at the age of 26, the youngest in Ohio history. And on election night, my mother and father were there, and I remember my mother saying to me, Johnny, what are you doing, okay? So I served there for 4 years. In my 3rd year there, we became the majority party, and I became the chairman of the health committee. If you're not in politics to get things done, then get out. And I learned at an early age that I needed to work with people who were the other party. Because I'm in the Senate, I'm a Republican, the House is Democrat. So had a successful tenure, and then at the end of those 4 years, I ran for Congress. I was 30 years old. Now in 1976, I went to the Republican convention. Well, this is really interesting. I went to the Republican convention, and I wasn't there to be a delegate. I went there to help a man who was working in the major center for Ronald Reagan, and they had this little booth, this little trailer set up, and these were the people who, because this was a contested convention in 1976. Reagan was challenging Jerry Ford, and it was a tough one. It was the last really great convention the Republicans had in terms of competitiveness. And this guy I was working for in the legislature, he had asked me to come out and help him, and when I got there, they said, we're short one hand. Do you think that you could manage 5 states for Governor Reagan? I had no idea what that meant. And I said, I absolutely can do it. And one of the states that I managed at that convention was the state of Iowa. And I'll tell you an interesting story. When it became clear that Ronald Reagan was going to lose, I went to a young politician from Iowa who decided to run for Congress. And he called me and he said, people don't think I'm conservative enough, and I want them to know that I was really for Reagan, and you released me to vote for Gerald Ford. You know who it was? Tom Taki. And so in 1976, I became a big fan of the Reagan and the Reagan formula and believed in it. In 1982, I run for Congress, and I'm running on the Reagan program. And I have to tell you, at that point in time, Reagan was very unpopular because the economy hadn't recovered yet. And in that election, in 1982, in a terrible year when we lost 26 Republican seats in Congress, I was the only Republican to defeat an incumbent Democrat in America. And one more time, my mother said, Johnny, what are you doing? And I go to Washington. So the first thing that happens is I get on the Defense Committee. And it's the only committee I was on. I didn't want a whole bunch of committees. I wanted to learn national security. And in a very short period of time, I was one of the people that found the wrenches and the hammers and the screwdrivers that cost thousands of dollars. Do you remember that? And it started me as a military reformer. There's nothing more important than having a strong national defense. But I got to tell you, we can't tolerate waste wherever it is. And inside that Pentagon today, there are so many bureaucrats tripping over one another, they can't get the job done the way they should. So as we rebuild our national defense, we better make sure that we rebuild the operation of that building. Because we will be wasting money if we don't get it done, and it will take away from the people who are serving our country. 6 years in, I got on the Budget Committee. Now, I went to my first Budget Committee meeting, and I was extremely disappointed with all the back and forth, and it didn't do much for me. And I was home in Ohio, and I was complaining about the Budget Committee, and some guy hears me at a gas station, and he walks up to me and says, what are you going to do about it? So I flew to Washington and got my staff in a room. And I said, we're going to write a budget for America. They're like, how are we going to do that? The White House has like hundreds of people, and they have 100 people up here on Capitol Hill, and we only have 6. I said, well, I know we're overstaffed, but if we stay out of each other's way, we can get this done. So I wrote a budget, and in 1989, there were 4 budgets offered. One by the President, one by the Democrats, one by the Black Caucus, and one by John Kasich. The vote on my budget that year was 405 no and 30 yes. How was I doing? She said it could be better. Well, I'll tell you what I thought. I had 29 other people who thought I could run the country. So we just kept at it, and for 10 years of my life, I pursued balancing the federal budget for like two or three reasons. One, if you don't have a balanced budget, you can't have economic growth. And let me give you the other reason. We do not have the right to have a big party and pass the bills on to our children. And it's a vision. It's about what government should do and what it shouldn't do. So in 1997, I am the chief architect of the balanced budget agreement. We cut taxes, and we balanced the budget 4 years in a row, and we paid down the largest amount of the public debt in modern history. And the economy was booming. You remember the late 90s and the early 2000s? And I left Washington. And when I left, it was a projected $5 trillion surplus. And I went back to Ohio, and they said, well, you know, now that you and your friends are gone, they're going to spend all the money. I said, you can't blow $5 trillion. Well, the Republicans in the House and the Senate and the White House did. And now we're 18 trillion in the hole. So I got out of politics, and I did a bunch of different things. I had like 5 things that I was doing. One of them is I worked for Lehman Brothers. I traveled all over America, working with entrepreneurs and people in the Silicon Valley and in financial services and heavy industry, and it was a wonderful experience. And some of you will remember, I worked at Fox News and I was a huge television star. Do you remember that? And if you don't remember it, I will send you tapes, okay? And then after 10 years, I thought I was done with politics. I kind of got a calling. So I decided to run for governor. I beat the incumbent, and I was the first one to defeat an incumbent Democrat or an incumbent of any party in 36 years. And when I won, I inherited a state that was a disaster. And part of the reason why I ran is I knew that if I won, I couldn't make things any worse. There was nowhere to go but up. It's sort of like running for president today, you know, there's only one way up. And so when I got in, as Mary Ann said, we were $8 billion in the hole, 20% of our operating budget. We had 89 cents in our rainy day fund. We had lost 350,000 jobs. And people were doubting the long-term future of the state. 4.5 years later, we went from $8 billion in the hole. We now have a $2 billion surplus. We've cut taxes by $5 billion, and I don't know, nobody's within, you know, anywhere close to that level of tax cuts. We've helped small business. We've killed the death tax, and we're working on killing death. We haven't figured that one out yet. And we have now grown private sector jobs to 350,000. And, you know, we're back. Our credit is strong. We're diversified, and Ohio's doing great. And here's the other thing I want you to know. As we've gotten stronger economically, if you are drug addicted, mentally ill, the working poor, developmentally disabled, autistic, part of the minority community, you are part of our family. Nobody gets left behind. You know, some people, it's really amazing to me that some folks try to say that because I care about poor people, that somehow I'm a liberal. I'll tell you what conservatism is to me. Conservatism is the ability for everybody to have an opportunity to rise. And throughout our lives, sometimes we get stuck in a ditch. My mother taught me when I was a little boy, it's a sin not to help somebody who needs help. It's equally a sin to continue to help somebody who needs to learn how to help themselves. And so we're helping people to rise. So we had an election in Ohio. You remember Ohio, you find out who wins, you know, even later than Iowa. Because it's close in Iowa, right? These presidential elections, everybody holds their breath. In Ohio, it takes 2 or 3 days to figure out who wins. So I won 86 out of our 88 counties. I got 26% of the African American vote, 60% of women, 51% of union households, and I had the second largest electoral victory in the history of our state. Now, I didn't think, and it's not so much about me, it's about a team. Now, let me just tell you 3 things, and then I'll shut up and take your questions. 3 things we need to do in our country. One is we need to have a legitimate program and be on the path to a balanced budget and stop all this nonsense. We got to get going, because what it'll do is it will create economic growth. And we need economic growth and job creation. Number 2, we've got to rebuild our military. But it is essential that as we rebuild our military, we now have over almost 1 million people who are bureaucrats working inside the Pentagon. That doesn't work. We need to streamline the Pentagon and then rebuild the military. And finally, we need to unite Americans. We need to restore this concept that the American dream just doesn't apply to some, it applies to everyone. And so in closing, I have the experience, the testing, the record. This is not some theoretical talk about what I might do. This is who I am and what I've done. We cannot afford to elect a president who has on-the-job training. The job is too big. So we need to examine who's got the ability and the record and the capability to be able to lift the country. Now, I know I don't work with a teleprompter and scripts and all that other stuff, and I know I'm pretty free-flowing. But maybe we ought to have a president that can talk from the heart and the brain once in a while, huh? Maybe we